Is the sound okay? Or is it too loud? Okay, good. So I'm a bit nervous. I haven't done this since 2019, before the pandemic, just so everyone knows. It's also a way for me to get some of the nervousness out by saying that. So yeah, this is my talk. Like, I realized that the title is a bit long, but it's basically, you know, about the game jamming and prototyping. So before we get started, I figure I would tell you a little bit about myself. Currently working at EA DICE as a lead environment artist. And for the past 5 years, I've been working on the Battlefield franchise. Currently working on the third one. And before that, I was working within VR on Apex Construct. Not to be confused with Apex Legends, which many people confused it with on release. And then prior to that, I was working at Horizon, the first Horizon game. And that was also kind of where I started my first big gig in the industry. And then I also added the Solus project because that's how I actually got my first internship. And that was a long distance internship, so I wasn't actually in the place. And I started my journey in the game industry at Uppsala University. And that's back when most of the game education didn't really have split tracks, so most of my bachelor was about game design. And then I eventually got interested in 3D, and that's when I moved on to study it a little bit more in depth at Future Games. So that's a little bit about my career. So the talk today is divided in 4 sections. We're going to talk about foundation, style choice, phases, and then it's just some quick tips and tricks for the jam itself. It's going to start with the foundation then, and well, game jam and prototyping is all about finding the fun quick. This is also a chance for you to try something new while you're at it. Compared to when you're in a full production or like later stage of a production, then it becomes a bit harder to do some experimentation because you're already set on what product you're supposed to deliver. So the prototype basically sets the base of what your game will be about, and that's how you can utilize a game jam as well. Many games that you do during a game jam, you're getting like fun and quick experiments, then they can be the seed to become something bigger and new. So that's why I put this in here, like focus on your game's unique aspect. I want to show you a few examples about games that are thinking a little bit outside of the box. First one is one of my old favorites, Katamari. If you haven't played it, it's basically a game where you roll up objects to create a bigger and bigger ball, and eventually you create planets and stars with it. And like the story is just that King Cosmo got drunk and destroyed the planets, and now it's your job to replace the planets and stars with objects from Earth, because Earth was spared for some reason. The next one is Splatoon, and this is what I would like to call a twist. It's a shooter, so nothing really unique there, but they added a twist in here, like a play on like what a normal shooter would be. Where you're still playing different teams, team versus team, but you paint ink, like squid ink, which helps you, like it's a fun game mechanics. You get faster, you can also interrupt the other player team. So it's like a fun little twist that you can add on something that is fairly common. And then Boktai. This is a play on hardware more than anything else. It's actually quite unique in that aspect. It was like a game for Game Boy Advance. You tilt the Game Boy to get and gather sunlight, and that is charging your mechanics or like your abilities in game. So depending on how much sunlight you get, the more powerful you are. So that's like just a way of using hardware. And Nintendo did that a lot with the first Nintendo DS as well, where they used the microphone and just like how you could clasp together the hardware. So one of the games that I myself had a lot of time was a survival game. I had a lot of fun with it. You were blowing into the mic to create fires, and they had some puzzle elements where you had to put sheets of paper together, and you did that by just closing your DS, and that's how you solve the puzzle. So small inventions like that with the hardware is also like something one can play with. And the last one is more a play on just being odd. So this is basically a life simulator. It's called Seaman. It was for Sega. So it's not really unique because there's a lot of life simulators out there, but there is a Japanese man's face on a fish. And eventually this fish grows up and crawls up on land, and well then you're done because well now it's happy and free, and then you start over. So this is more odd than unique, but it's still making your game stand out. So with this example, I want to show like Katamari with the mechanics, Splatoon with like a twist on something that is not like that unique in itself as a shooter, Boktai with the hardware, and Seaman that is just being odd. But this is all about finding the core of your project. And even as an artist, this is something one has to think about and keep in mind all the time, that it's adherent and staying connected to what the core of the game is. Because this like foundation you create is the core of your project. And there is like different way one can tackle this, but for a game jam and a prototype, I like to divide it into 4 sections. And this is also not meant to be a book as I wrote. It's more like a quick draft that you make, and you can expand on this later, but it's supposed to be high-level pointers. So these are the 4 steps that I added in here. You can divide it in different ways, but probably some people have heard about pillars at the very least. You can also make pillars in kind of anything. In the beginning of a project, it's usually game design pillars, but for a jam, I will call it more like the overall pillars. That's what I will work with. It's like touching base on like anything you're making for the game rather than just focus on the gameplay. And then you have tone and setting as well. It's just like a way of going deeper and deeper into what was your core values. But for a game jam, it's enough to just focus on the core values and the pillars. There's no need to like dwell deeper, but we're going to cover them anyway if one likes to do that. So the core values, like, there's a bit of what we already talked about. It's like about finding the uniqueness with your game. What is it about? Themes and emotion. Anything that you can think about that you want the player to experience when you're playing. So you write a few sentences about this, like anything that comes to mind. And this becomes the foundation part of your pillars. And as I mentioned before, you can make pillars in anything, but for this it's better to focus on just the overall ones. Like later down in the project, like we usually in art have art direction pillars, and then you can delve deeper into that, and there's like sound pillars as well, like depending on the themes as well. But I will start like looking at the core values, brainstorm a few ideas for each of the sentences you made. They should be describing each aspect. But then you go in and refine them. 3 to 5 strong pillars align with the core values. But for a jam, like keep it small. There's no need to add a lot of the pillars. It's better to just do like 1 or 2. I would recommend 3 because it then at least becomes a little bit more context to it. And then you do a definition pass on it. So every pillar should be clear, concise, and easy to understand, and use keywords. But the important point here is that the entire team understands what the pillars are about. So don't go and use like fancy wording that no one will understand. That's not the point. The point is that everyone in the team understands what they're set out to do, because everyone will be working on different things on the game. So an example then with one of my favorite games, Katamari. And this is not the official pillars, it's just a breakdown I made myself. I think one of the pillars, at least overall pillars, is chaos. And that is like the description for that, like very short, would be what is happening. But it doesn't mean like it should be random. It should be a orderly chaos within everything, the character, dialogue, level, sound, and style. but a red thread across everything. And the second one is playground. And the reason why I chose playground is because it's not really a sandbox. A sandbox is something you say when it's an open world and you can do anything. Katamari still has restrictions even though it's a playground. They have like a lot of hurdles, like you can become like bigger and bigger, but you still can't roll up objects that are larger than you. You need to grow big enough to roll up the next objects. And then the third one is hoard. So it's just basically collect everything and anything. That's the premises and the base of Katamari. And it's also like going into then collecting gameplay objectives, new characters, abilities, and just as a last one I wrote anything, but it's still tied to the middle pillar where you have the restriction of objects that are larger than you can't roll up because you need to achieve that objective first. So if the pillars are the interaction a player has with the game, the tone is more now a player perceives the game. So pillar can also be what the player experience. It's just a matter of how much detail like to dive into them, and if you want to categorize it more as game design pillars or overall pillars, art direction pillars, and so on. But the idea is that the tone should help you to do a continuation of your pillars. And this is something then that might not be needed for a game jam, but it can help you set some of the foundation for content creation. So again, Katamari, which is whimsical and playful, humorous dialogue, and again the odd story with King Cosmos being drunk and destroying the solar system. It's also quirky and eccentric characters. So that is the whimsical and playful tone. And then you have chaotic and surreal, and again I used the word chaotic, and it's because it should be like a red line and just dwelling more into details. And it's again touching on like you rolling up all sorts of objects and becoming like increasing your size, but it's also a bit unpredictable because you can collect various sorts of objects that doesn't really match. It's not like small cubes. It can be very long and cylindrical objects, which means that your Katamari can all of a sudden start going in a different direction than you intended because it has it's not a round shape anymore. And then just absurd worlds and giant creatures and bizarre landscapes. And it's supposed to be positive and uplifting, and this is touching a bit on the music aspect as well, upbeat and energetic music, and lots of colors. So the last one is setting, and this doesn't necessarily just refer to the environment you play in. It's like anything that has to do with like what your setting is for the player. It can be the characters as well. It's the physical space and the time period, as well as the relationship and culture and historical aspect of the game as well. And then for Katamari, these are the three ones, and again, they're not the official ones, so one can think however they want about the game. But the three settings I chosen is familiar and oddworldly elements, and that's because you usually start in a very small room, a corner, and that's very familiar. Everyone knows what it looks like, especially if you're Japanese, and because there's Japanese rooms you start in. But then once you start growing and getting bigger and bigger, you're getting out to the city, you get to meet all of these more absurdities. There's like Godzilla, floating islands, mushrooms, and it just becomes more and more bizarre. And then you have colorful and simple, and that's because it's very bold colors. And now we're touching a little bit more about how we want to create the art. It's like Japanese pop culture, minimalism, it's 3D. So here we know it's not a 2D game, it's actually a 3D game. And then I added space. So even if you're not playing in the space itself, space is a big part of the story for Katamari. It's also a big part of the UI, and also in the end you're actually making stars and planets. So space is there all the time as a theme. It's just that you're not playing in space. It's also part of the gameplay objective. So one of the earliest things you have to do in one of the first games is to make the planet Mercury. And by doing so, you need to make sure that you have enough liquid objects in your Katamari, or the King Cosmos will deem your planet unworthy, and you will have to make a new Katamari that is having more liquids in it. So that is the first section. That's usually how I plan and think about art. I just don't start diving into art. I actually think about all of these like aspects of the game first, like the overall and how they tie together, and make some rules before actually going into the art planning. It's a good thing to write down these things, and then you keep that in mind throughout the entire like project, and even when you do a prototype. So, second section is more about the art phases. So these are like just some suggestions on how one will be planning these phases. There's like tons of ways of doing this, and then production have their own timelines and methods and so on. But for a art jam, this is what I would go into. I think the slides went a bit ahead of me. That was going to be my point, that even if you plan a lot, time is going to be your constraint. But the point I want to make here is also that you don't do these step by step and you're done. You actually go back as a loop all the time. So you iterate. You start with your references and asset list. You place a block out in the engine. You work in like sections and work iteratively all the time. And then you go back and revise your references and asset list, because you will find out more once you move into the engine and into that space. And a good thinking is that don't be narrow-minded when you're like getting into the actual like production part of creating assets. It's better to get around 50% there on everything, because it will look consistent and coherent, and no one will know actually that you plan on making like, you know, a super realistic game. It's better to make everything look like it was intended and like belong together than going into sections and be like, well, this is now 100% finished and the rest is just a gray box. So the asset list then, I just want to show an example. There's several ways you can do it. This example I have here is more focused on if you're moving in sections, like in iterative progress, it's like dividing the assets into like categories, like do the UV for everything, do the light mapping for everything, the texture for everything. And if you keep yourself accountable to that, you will have all of the content you have to a specific phase. And then if you don't have the time, at least stuff is coherent. But an asset list doesn't need to be in this way. You can do it as, you know, in-depth as you like, or think about it in another way. Like this one is priority-based instead, where it's more like you list everything you need, and you know that, well, we agree in the group that 1 and 2 we're going to make, and if we can't make it by the end of the first day, we're just going to cut the rest. But at least we know then we have the base foundation for the game. And anything else is just a bonus. And you can go even more simple and just use a notepad and list down what you need. But this is still going to be helpful for your teammates in case someone needs to know, going to make sound for all of these things. Or someone maybe want to already place light or do some scripting for some of these things. They're already aware of, you already agree on what's going to make it into the game. And if we're speaking about not really a game jam where you're very limited on time, but you want to make a prototype, I usually go more visual and do visual breakdowns instead of lists. So this is more based on a concept, and you do a breakdown on the concept instead. It's still an asset list in there, but it's more visual. It's also easier when you talk with other people in the team that might not know what you're imagining in your head stuff to be, and then you can show them. So even if you intend for this to be maybe more cartoony, people will still know what you're thinking by just adding more visual. And here you can already start seeing a breakdown on like tiling textures and other things that you want to have. And you can go as detailed as you want in this, or well, as sparse as you like as well with a visual planning. So reference